Welcome to the Leadership Passport podcast, where we dive into journeys, challenges, and insights of school and education leaders from around the world. And I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, Dr. Stephen Harris. Stephen is the co-founder and chief learning officer of Learnlife, a growing global network of innovative lifelong learning hubs. Learnlife Barcelona is a registered international school, pioneering a new approach to education within this expanding network. His focus on educational transformation stems from his PhD and extensive experience as principal of Northern Beaches Christian School and founder of the Sydney Centre for Innovation in Learning, a research and innovation centre that existed concurrently. Notably, the Learnlife Rwanda program supports adult learners in developing entrepreneurial skills. A recognised leader, he continues to drive innovation in creating future-oriented learning environments worldwide. Stephen is also the co-founder, as I mentioned, an inaugural partner of Learnlife Rwanda, which is establishing entrepreneurship programs for adults in Kigali. He splits his time between Sydney, Barcelona, and Kigali. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
Great to have you. Yeah, really appreciate your time. So you shared with me a little bit earlier about a really interesting and kind of non-typical year of, I guess, education you had growing up. Can you share a bit more about that?
Yeah, it was probably the year I look back as the year I learnt most. And ironically, it was as a younger child, aged 11, I'd learnt to play the system. My father was a university professor, and he was having a year's sabbatical over in the UK, and we were living in New Zealand. That's where I was born. And the boat trip there is about 38 days long. And in those days, the New Zealand Correspondence School had sort of printed off all of the paperwork and all of the exercises for the year that we had to do. And life on the boat, apart from visiting lots of interesting countries on the way through, meant that we could just fly through the stencils, the paperwork, and we actually got basically the whole year done on the trip going over, which then freed us up. I had two other brothers coming with me at that point, and the younger one was he wasn't doing correspondence school. It was just myself and my slightly older brother, and we did the whole year in about in those 38 days, which meant that we had the year off. And the year off didn't mean not learning, because I guess because of Dad's focus as an ancient history professor, we explored the Roman ruins of England, medieval castles whenever we could find them, and going through. And I guess that memory is that when you remove every boundary around a kid, I loved learning. Yeah,
and what a wonderful story, but also a little bit disturbing that the education system of New Zealand deemed you could not only do an entire year technically of what they deemed was the appropriate level of schoolwork in 38 days, and yet your compatriots were the entire year in school. And I wonder, what were they doing for the other 140 odd days?
I mean, that's a very, very interesting point. I can make three quick comments on that one. I know that there's a Nigerian study recently where they've managed to get a sort of a trial group of people, and I don't know how many, whether it was like 20, 30, 40 or how many, basically did 2 years of Nigerian curriculum in 6 weeks by using AI tutors. So that's one little story. I know there's the Alpha School in Texas, and they're trialing, or they're not trialing, they're using a model where there's 2 hours of intensive AI-generated tutorials, and they're finding there that the results they give are suggesting that if you're wanting to improve kids on the American standardized scales, they're doing extremely well. And I've also got a 15-year-old great nephew who has got long COVID, and so he's not able to go to school. Now, he initially struggled a little bit with online learning, but after a couple of years now, he said he'd never go back to school, because he said so much time is wasted simply walking around. When you think about the way in which schools are organized, in that sort of control compliance mode with kids in different classes. So I think the reality is, it's time for us to be having a very close look at saying, what our time waste is in a school. And I know that as principal of Northern Beaches, we shifted to a session day, because for a couple of reasons. The number of opportunities for kids to get into negative interactions got reduced by about 70%, because there was always a 15-minute break, apart from the lunch one between lessons. That actually almost got rid of all of that issue completely. And you sort of think, okay, the schools that have a 7 or an 8 period day, they're creating both time wasting things, but also corridor interactions which don't prove helpful.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. So just on a completely topic altogether, if your leadership style was a song or a movie, what would it be or why?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I think the best one I could come up with is "Don't worry, be happy." So, I think you don't want to finish up being a leader if you don't enjoy it, and you are going to confront difficult tasks and difficult days, but ultimately you've got to actually have that, I guess, that mental capacity to be able to put into a box whatever's happening, no matter how difficult, complex, or painful it is, and just sit back and say, "Don't worry, be happy." So I think that was my choice.
Fantastic. We can't take ourselves too seriously all the time, can we?
No, no.
So to talk a little bit about your leadership journey, you referenced little bits of it earlier. What inspired you to become an education leader?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I have to say, on the one hand, nothing, and on the other hand, everything. Um, because I did finish up, my schooling was across 3 countries and 5 different school types. Everything from, um, I went to an extremely elite Oxford preschool, and all I can remember is being sent out to the veranda. So I suspect I was fairly ADHD and they couldn't cope. But all the way through to finishing up in Sydney, in a large government boys' high school, which was a bit of a shock coming from New Zealand. And I think, my view with education and with leadership, I guess this all ties in together, is that, we're the adults responsible for what we create. And as a leader, now you've got the opportunity to be creative and to do what you think is right. And so that, in one sense, my model just evolved from the sense that there's no reason why kids should dislike schooling or educate. Well, I can understand schooling. There's no reason why kids should dislike learning. And I guess my motivation there is that, as a leader, what is it that we should change, alter, or improve, or get rid of? That would mean that no child is left behind.
Because if we're not going to do it, who is?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Or if we just adopt a model that's there because the model is there. I heard a great definition of innovation this week watching a YouTube clip, and it was, innovation is the ability to sort of look at the group norms and then decide to go your own pathway. I quite like that.
Yeah,
It
I
captures
like
me
that.
well.
Good. I'm wondering if you can identify a defining moment in your leadership journey that really crystallized some things for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'd been a sort of a leader of a school or a deputy principal, for 30 years, actually, before I stepped back into the international education scene. I guess that was, the first 10 years or 7 or 8 years as deputy, I watched a lot, and I don't want to sort of make any comment that's negative, but I learned a lot from what I decided I would never do. And one thing was that I would never hold a senior leadership meeting on a Monday morning locked away in a room. That I think, there are so many counterintuitive things that happen in schools, and you think, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Going through. Um, I, I think that the most aha moment or releasing moment was I was exploring the use of online learning in 2005 in Iceland. I had a scholarship from Macquarie University to travel a number of countries, and they had this impossible word in Icelandic to read. Was the motto of the education department, and I asked them what was the word, what did it mean, And they said, do then think. And that just resonated with me because up until, I mean, even now, so many people are are frightened of doing something. If there's not like a whole litany of research that supports that, if they make one little step, there's all this research which is going to suggest that it's 95% likely to be successful. I guess for me, I threw that out. We're intelligent beings. We work collaboratively together. We can pick up problems or challenges or trends, pretty rapidly. And I love that freedom. And I asked them, I said, why do you have that motto, do then think? And they said, well, we're a small country. We can't afford to sit around and not be agile and be at the head of the game. And I guess for me that I'd always done that, but it liberated me because I thought, okay, I'm not the only person that thinks that way. And it doesn't mean that I don't like research or I don't like thinking, but now when you have a process of leadership where you're trying to collectively envision and you come up with a direction you want to go through, and you then um, I mean, that's the other mantra I would have, is that vision isn't vision if it's not grown by other people immediately. In other words, we could set up what we think is the vision, but that should be so exciting or compelling for the people that we work with that they start adding on their ideas, and it's like a tree that they're putting the leaves and the flowers onto, going through. Now, if something doesn't work, well, then you evaluate it and you tweak it, and you either reshape it and redo it, or you decide not now. Yeah.
Yeah. So you were talking a little bit more, the example from Iceland just
Yeah.
earlier. I wonder if there's other kind of aha moments that you've discovered in your work internationally across different cultures. We heard in your bio some of the work you do in really interesting places around the world in unique and innovative programs.
Yeah, that's an extremely good question, and I'll give another little anecdote. Well, I like giving anecdotes. Um, I discovered I could never show a picture of Australian schools in Spain, and the reason being that whenever I had pictures of what might be called modern learning environments, it's how they would call them, and people wanted to see them. I got sidetracked by questions the whole time about why the kids wearing uniform, and then I didn't realise how deeply an issue culturally in Spain the post-Franco world is, because the moment they saw kids in uniform, they immediately went back to Franco and they said, this is what he tried to do to our country. And then I worked out then that I could never show an image of an Australian school with a child in it. I had to remove all the kids from it if I wanted to use anything for a talk or for a workshop in that way. And I guess also having worked in Rwanda, over 17 years, I mean, hats off to them there that they've actually managed to get about 98% of the country into school. And their biggest challenge now is quality rather than the quantity of, they're successful in the quantity, but the quality is the challenge. In some cases, again, recognizing that there are some extremely hardworking teachers in those contexts. Now, just imagine if you took a person from a developed country and put them into a context where you've got a space that hasn't got a firm floor, so it's dirt. It's inside a building that hasn't actually got windows in the window frames, and there's no door. The electricity doesn't work, and the blackboard is actually unwritable. And you've probably got 80 kids, and they're sitting 5 to a table that would seat 2 in another country. Now, when you take the traditional industrial colonial education system and you make it its worst version possible, well, then you see what you have to change. Now, you can see immediately, this is ridiculous, this is ridiculous. Why have you got the sense that you can only be learning inside that space? And I can remember with one of the schools I was working at, high up on the slopes of Mount Karasumbi on the DRC border, and I'd offered to run a workshop for the teachers and the kids. And I said, well, don't just put the kids into classrooms and tell them to sit there silently for 2 hours. They can come out and watch what we're going to do. And we had this enormous circle because there were about 1,000 kids in this mountain school. Very rocky because it was a volcanic place. And we were going to do improv theatre. That's how I thought, okay, this is what we'll do. We'll help. It met the goal of what we're trying to do. And the corner of my eye, I could see they had unscrewed a blackboard from a classroom and they were going to carry it out to put behind me. I just shook my head and said, no, no, no. I said, we don't, you can teach without a blackboard going through. But I think, culturally, you have to look at the culture that you're in. If I make a strong comment about Australia, Australia's biggest problem is that we do mediocre incredibly well. And because of that, nothing changes. You get politicians who want to then throw in the word literacy and numeracy into their political speak, and nothing changes. I can say that because I've seen it for 45 years. And that's the problem in Australia. We do average pretty well. But is that what we want for the country? The answer is no. And the only way to change that is to then say, well, what do we have to then change? And I guess that's why I like where I'm working now in Learnlife, because we did start with that notion of let's throw everything out that is a blocker to learning and then reconstruct what we think is useful. And actually, it was only with that fairly radical mindset that we're able to then create what we're creating there. And then you work backwards to then say, well, where do you need the scaffolding? Where do you need the below the surface iceberg part to make the top part work? Because I'm not an advocate for a free range chicken farm. I can see the benefit of structure completely. And part of leadership is being able to have all of that in your head at the one time and recognize where you've got to work. I mean, there are a couple more aha moments. I think when I looked at people, the teachers struggling with kids' behavior, and I thought, I knew that, a lot of that issue, okay, the kids had done the wrong thing perhaps, but why had they done the wrong thing? It's because they were in a structure or a system or a relationship hierarchy that was inevitably going to produce the problem that actually came out. So I made two decisions. This is probably about 10 years before I finished off at Northern Beaches. One was I was never going to expel a child again. And secondly, I was going to talk about plan B with the parents with a child that was, had oppositional defiance or ADHD, or it was a kid that was actually obviously at risk of not being able to cope in that community. Now, I guess it didn't mean that we never lost kids from the school, but what it meant was that I had to then work with the family for them to realise this is actually currently the wrong environment for your child. They're simply not able to cope with the cultural norms that are expected, and remove judgment from that and simply say it's actually the wrong place. Let's discuss where your child might go. And I've got some really great stories from the Australian context where some complex kids finished up going to a boarding school and in the country and loving agriculture, and actually they never looked back, and they finished up very successful in their careers and everything else. But I think the issue was they were simply in the wrong environment, and the parents possibly didn't see that with clarity. And I guess also, you don't want to walk down the street with someone that you've had a hard conversation. Perhaps you've had to then say you've got to leave, and look at them in the eye and not actually be able to talk with them. And I guess for me, on that relational side, I just made the decision, no, I don't want to ever do that again. I want to have a context where the child actually can see there are other options, which are great. And let's discuss those. And then the plan B one also was good. If you to get parents in before an issue happens and say, the chances of this happening, we know, are fairly high. And you're struggling at home, we're struggling at school. Let's talk about what will we switch into if and when something happens. And that's a far more successful strategy, because the parents, if I rang them up and said, okay, it's happened, let's talk. We had the plan there, and it often involved grandparents. It often involved family members. It might have involved even going interstate for a while, but it was restorative, and it was I know the restorative justice circles, and I like all of those things, but this was actually preventative. It was, and then the question for all of the staff is to then say, what haven't you changed that you need to change because you're the adult in charge of the space? Because the problem is actually ultimately ours, not the child's.
Yeah, and it's so. I think it's so important to have those and in those conversations you talk about with students and parents, to have like a pathway forward, regardless
Yeah.
of what might happen. There's a pathway, rather than, because I think that's a cause of a lot of issues. People just see a dead end, or
Yeah.
you're just closing the door, and they can't see what that next step is. And if you can help them to understand, like you said, whether that's staying at this school or finding somewhere else that's better suited and can better match what they need, but allowing them to see that there is a pathway forward no matter what happens is really important.
Yeah. In which case, you've also got to get rid of your office, because I would never hold those conversations in a room with the door closed. Hold it at a coffee shop. Northern Beaches actually has got a cafe right in the middle of the school, which was deliberate. From my perspective, that's what we needed. But no, and I worked out with kids with ADHD or oppositional defiance disorder. Don't sit down facing them. Sit next to them where you can't see each other's faces. Because we had so many building projects happening, I could also then whack on a hard hat, and we could go for a walk onto the building site and do something which no other kid could do, which I know it annoyed and irritated some teachers. Why could they not go and do that? But it was the perfect place to go and suddenly humanize a kid that had triggered and tripped off, and you could lean against a rail, both look out and have the conversation. And I found that if you adjusted the strategies, they would invariably work. And I mean, for that reason, I actually got rid of my office. And in theory, I was supposed to have a mobile phone or something with me so my PA could actually find me. But of course, I never deliberately chose that. So I would, the first half of the day was wandering around a large, we had 1,400 kids, wandering around the school, just seeing what was happening and being visible and being there. But if you need to have a conversation that's challenging, even with a staff member, have it over a cup of coffee in a cafe where there's greater equity. Yeah.
Oh, I feel sorry for your PA. You must have put them through the ringer. So,
She was extremely tolerant, and she'd always, when she would find me, she'd always try to give me water or feed me. I said, "It's all right. I'm not dying. I'm actually quite happy."
very good, very good. So you were touching on a couple of things there about the realities of leadership.
Yeah.
What's the toughest leadership challenge you've faced, and how did you navigate it?
Yeah, that's an extremely good question. Apart from being principal at Northern Beaches, I was also an inspector for one of the school systems on behalf of the government. And I visited this school that was in chaos and crisis. And what had been mentioned in federal parliament was about to get closed down. It had a whole range of things in it, and financially I could see that it was collapsing. About 3 weeks later, after having led the inspection, the board chair turned around and said, "Could I take over the school temporarily?" And I knew that, okay, I had to do this as a bit of a volunteer and do it alongside my other role. And then I also knew that they were wildly overstaffed. In fact, they had 104 staff and they had 52 more than they should have had. And I knew that when my first day to help them, I actually had to dismiss 52 people. But I knew that if I didn't do it then, very early November, they would never have a chance of getting a job before next February. So I thought, no, I've just got to do it. I worked with the person who was the campus head, and they said, look, we've got to create a team who are going to be resilient, who are going to be the survivors who will move this forward. Now, by the way, this school is thriving 20 years down the track later, so I can just say that before I won't give you the name of the school. But then I said, okay, every staff member is going to receive a letter, and they're going to be asked, we had a meeting at the end of the day, my first day, and I said, take the letter home, open it up either with a friend there or by yourself. Don't open it at school. And half of you are going to finish up being asked to leave, and the half are going to be asked to stay. And I said, those who are staying, everyone's going to move office and space, and we're going to create collaborative spaces that are different. So that, I guess the choice there was to say, yeah, even in the hardest of circumstances, and boy, did I hate having to do it. That greater goal was what drove me to then say, we just have to do this, because if I don't do it, the whole school's going down. And also that with the teachers, I thought they had to have the best time frame to be able to find another job. And I think, in 90-something% of them did, because of that. So that was tough, but I would only ever do those things with a team. I relied very heavily on the guy who was the campus head and the team that was around him. I've always been a strong believer that leadership isn't solo; it's team.
Yeah. Yeah. What a challenge. So, wonder what's one mistake that's shaped your leadership approach?
Yeah, that's another interesting question. Probably not acting soon enough. I think I think, but well, by the time I was with that school, that was a number of years, and I'd been a leader for 14 years at two schools by that point, and I knew that you just had to act. And I think probably being overly cautious. Now I'm laughing saying this because my nickname is Hurricane. I was never perceived to be slow, and that name has transferred through to Spain as well, going through. But I think, again, when it comes to leadership, if you know that there's a challenge, don't sit around and let it get worse. Do the people work to solve it, and that means that you've got to have the hardest of conversations with people from a relational perspective, which means there's got to be respect and no judgment. And I think that's probably something I learnt. Um, there are things that I would have done in the 1990s in my first role as deputy, which I would never do again. But I did those because I felt pressured, and that system wanted me to do those things. Whereas, I learnt pretty fast to say, no, I can do it my way, and I have always done it my way.
Great. Great. Is there a leadership practice or habit that's changed the game for you?
Um, yeah, well, look, I think the getting rid of my office. Now, I know that the guy that has replaced me, at Northern Beaches, I actually designed a space that could become the office for whoever took over after me, because I knew that, okay, you can't expect that everyone would actually just operate in the same way. And he's certainly set that up very nicely. So no criticism there. But for me, getting rid of the office and the idea of a door that was either open or closed changed so many things. It meant that I was gradually perceived quite differently. It meant that I got, you know, I could go into any space, and this is the same at Learnlife in this context. Learnlife is a series of studios and open spaces. There's no designated classroom space that you close the door and you can't see into. I mean, there are spaces which you can close off, but you can still see into them. Is that you've got to become seen to be a person that's not entering any space as a threat, that you're solely there to support. Now, you don't do that as a leader by yourself, and you don't do that without a team. And so, therefore, at every point, you've got to then empower the teams. And I think one of the if I say tricks of the trade that I learned was, I sat down there were 34 on the leadership team at one stage, 2014 at Northern Beaches, and we sat them down, and I said, if no one loses status or salary, would they be prepared to enter into conversation about restructuring everyone's role so that it supported where we wanted to go, not where we've been? And we got the agreement, and we did finish up doing it. It was over a period of 4 weeks, conversations after schools, coming up with a model that actually was far more efficient in terms of the use of people, freed up 3 people who could then become constant curriculum pedagogic coaches the whole time. But that came because I worked with a team. I could never have come in and just said, "This is what we're going to do." Which is also, I guess, the whole focus of my PhD is collective envisioning. That you don't do these things by yourself. You can't finish up as the visionary and then disappear because the vision's going to die. It's got to be a collective process. Yeah. I've probably
So,
strayed a long way from your original question.
no, not at all. Not at all. What's one piece of advice you'd give to an aspiring school leader?
Well, first of all, do it. I think, I meet a lot of people who are frightened of becoming that leadership, and I get that because it's a challenging role. But go back to my original song. Well, two things. Add in the song my way, but be happy. Don't go into leadership frightened. I can remember the very first time I was actually, as a year advisor, asked to run an assembly at Springwood, in the Springwood High School, 1,700 kids. I said to someone, how do you stand up the front and shut them all up? You know, at an assembly. And he said, oh, it's quite simple. You just take a clipboard with you, you hold it, and they'll just look at you. And that worked. And there was nothing on the clipboard, but I stood there in front of 1,700 kids, held the clipboard, and everyone stared at me going through. Look, there's no rule book for leadership. I love reading about leadership and leadership in business and leadership in, especially leadership connected to high emotional intelligence. That's, for me, that would be the area of passion at the moment, to say, we've got an entire workforce that has to shift out of knowledge content deliverers, because AI can probably do that better. But the opportunity is for them to become the motivators. Now, the problem is teachers have been trained to be content deliverers, not motivators. And so actually, as leaders, we actually, I would say now, if I had to encourage anyone, learn as much as you can about neuroscience and how to lead a community of integrity from a relational perspective, because that's what you're going to have to do with the kids.
Very good. And as you as you were talking then about how do you get in front of that many kids and get their attention and hold their attention, I had this flashback to my high school days when I was a student, and I was in a very large high school, and the principal at the time, to get our attention, there was 1,500 kids in the assembly space. He was a short fellow, so he'd drag a chair in, and he wouldn't carry it. He'd drag a chair in from the side right to the middle, and then he'd stand on it. And then, I'm not sure this had passed these days, but he'd wave a $50 note around, because he was a bit grumpy as well. But he'd wave a $50 note. And one time he said, "Look, there was some fights going on, and a bit of argy bargy in the afternoons, and behind the shed and things like that." So he said, "Look, I know there's something planned for the Savo. First one to come and tell me, you get $50." And then he hopped off his chair and dragged it off the stage. I mean, he had all of our attention, 100%. I'm not sure that's the right way to go about it, but that was his trick of the trade, I guess.
Yes, provided it doesn't go one step forward into offering $1 million prize for people who want to vote a certain way.
Yes.
Stay clear of politics, okay? It's interesting. The international school system, I think, has got a great opportunity, because we work with NIASC, with our accreditation in Barcelona. They want people to be different. They want the change. They want the learning paradigm to be shifting away from the teacher-centered to the more learner agency focused. So, for me, the international school system, as far as I've now seen it, it's ripe for transformation. But you just need to have the people who are prepared to do it, and to recognise that it's never going to be a situation of saying we do it one way, we switch tomorrow and do it the other way. I think the one thing I like about Learnlife at the moment as a leader is I'm watching the team come up with incredible innovations that work so beautifully. And the one is that, okay, we don't promote exams in the slightest, but we actually have a group of kids preparing for exams. Now, those kids, they've opted into the studio because they want to learn, how do I blitz an exam, whatever the topic is. And so they've been taught the skills of how do you do well in an exam, because they might need to do an American SAT or a British A-level or whatever else. But the whole cohort doesn't need to do that. So let's get rid of the focus on the content. Let's have a look at the psychology of exams and train kids to become strong in exams. Then they can actually opt into what's called open path learning, where they can say, okay, I no longer need to go to the courses that you're running, because I can do it by myself. Now, for me, that is a far stronger end of school going through. But, that wasn't my idea. That came from the team. So again, I think, the international school system has got amazing teachers. A lot of them are very mobile. I know that. Use the mobility and the agility to do the change. Don't sit back and hope that it happens over 5 years.
So if you if you had a magic wand, what's one thing that you might change about international education? If you could kind of snap your fingers and make it happen tomorrow, as obviously unrealistic as that
Okay,
is,
yeah.
what might that be?
Okay, not just international, it's all education. It's the traditional examination system, I know, is what actually tethers everyone back to traditional teaching, explicit teaching. And I've got nothing wrong, there's nothing wrong with direct instruction and all of those methodologies. They work in many, many cases, but not when the exam has been placed as the final curtain that you've got to get through before you can get into the world beyond that. If we could get rid of anything, it would be if we got rid of the exam system as it currently stands. I mean, it was the one hopeful I saw in the pandemic was that people started to see that some of the senior students that weren't doing so well in the context of their learning, online learning in that context, wasn't because they weren't intelligent. It was because they were probably holding down a part-time job. They were probably rearing a sibling and everything else. And we got a window into the world of multiple families that you never actually saw, literally because we actually, the cameras were there. There were two ways until the kids learned they could turn them off and then pretend that they had power outages and all sorts of stuff. But I think, it's the exam system that people are frightened of, and it keeps them thinking it's the most important part of life. We all know when you get through the exam system, it means nothing. It's been used as a doorway to the next stage. There are so many other doorways that we could create.
Fantastic. Okay, a couple of quick questions to wrap things up. Your favorite book on leadership?
Um, I've been a fan of Cotter, Professor Cotter. His book Accelerate. Now that it's sort of on leadership, but it's more on the leadership models. He wrote that in 2014, I think it was. I mean, you either buy it as the book Accelerate, the word, or the letter XL and number 8. What he came up with there was talking about that you can have a dual operating system happening in a school or in an organisation. It was you have the hierarchy, and the hierarchy's kept the stability and it keeps the budget and keeps the whole thing going. But then you need to have the coalition of the willing, and any person from the community of the hierarchy, whatever their role in the school, could opt into the coalition of the willing. And they would be the ones that would be the change drivers. And the hierarchy then would switch around to supporting the initiatives of the coalition of the willing. So no one was devalued. So you've got the person who just loved doing the accounts perfectly. They didn't have to change because they suddenly saw their role was something that actually supported this other role. And I think it's sort of about leadership, but it's more about system change. And I think for me, leaders have to have those two things in their heads. You can't just think about how do I become, go from good to great. Yeah, I get that completely. But it's also about how do you lead the community that you're in, and how do you ignite the energy that's required to move the community to where they need to be. And I think that's, for me, he's always, his work's just resonated with me as well. I mean, I've read all Maxwell's stuff on leadership and a whole range of other books. They're all useful, but I think I like Cotter because it combined leadership with systemic change. Also, the other one, there's a model, not so much a book, but it's a Denison model of change. And what I liked in that one was it looked half of the 360 looked externally and half looked internally. And on the internal, one quarter had a look at how consistent is the operation. That for me was a really good challenging question as a leader to say, could I say that every child that came into the community, whether it's Learnlife, whether it's Northern Beaches, wherever it was experiencing the same consistently positive learning experience? And the answer was no. So therefore, what do we need to change in order for that consistency to become a reality? And I quite like that particular focus as a leader, was to then say, could I pick any person in the community, child, parent, teacher, and review their daily or weekly experience, and was it consistently positive? Because if it's not, then that's when you've got the work to do. You've got to adjust. You've got to change. Yeah.
Yeah, and on that note, one of the you talked about reviewing the student's perspective or the child's perspective. One of the most powerful things I've experienced is actually walking a day in the child's shoes, experiencing, like you talked before, some places 8 lessons in a day, all of those transitions plus 2 lunches, going to
Yeah.
all of those things, being organized, all the different expectations in each of those 8 classes is exhausting. And
Yeah.
that was a really eye-opening experience for me, because you just makes you sit back and go, just wow, what are we doing to these poor kids?
I think that the insight that I got into that one was that kids are experiencing cultural influences every day, all day long, from multiple sources. Some from their family, some from their wider ethnicity, but a lot from advertising and simply being out in the streets going through. The question is, can you shape a culture of learning and positive learning experience that's stronger, subliminally stronger than the other cultures that might work against the success of the child? That becomes the goal of the school, to say, how do we build that culture where a child is feeling welcomed, safe, secure, and thriving so that they can flourish going through. That's the work of a leader, because that's what you're trying to aim for in that context. And that's about culture shaping, and not being frightened of culture shaping, because there are so many messages kids are getting which are anti-learning culture. Yeah.
One thing daily you do that helps you to lead better?
Remember that I'm a failure. No, no, remember that I'm normal. Yeah, I think, yeah, leaders should never get themselves, I, it was probably the best thing, and also sometimes the most frustrating thing, when you walk into a large staff room, and 175 staff, and I think, okay, what's happening? Oh, no, I'm the leader. I'm the one that has to do it. Now, that was a good mindset, because it meant that I was actually firmly still not seeing myself in a ridiculous way as being important, because I was never important. So I think that's a good strategy. So therefore, what can you do to keep yourself in that space? Well, you've got to find the actions that do that. And that could be going for a run, going for a walk. Um, Over the years, I've loved going to Chinese massage therapists in Sydney, because I have an hour where no one can contact me, and I can actually completely get rid of everything, all the clutter from my brain, in that context, provided they don't fall asleep. But I think, again, find a strategy where you can declutter your brain and reset your brain each day, and never get yourself in a position where you think you're important.
Good. A leader, past or present, you admire?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, if we went into the world of politics, I'd have to say, when I listened to Obama's speech in 2008, the night that he got elected, that inspired me, because there was a person who had a vision for the country, going through. There are a number of education people around the world who always inspire me. I love chatting with them, because you get the energy in the mutual conversations with them, and I could rattle off probably a dozen or 2 dozen people in that context, from every country. So I think it's the like-minded people, not like-minded in the sense that we all copy each other, but like-minded in that we're questioning, the people that ask questions going through. I love finding someone on LinkedIn where the questions are going to challenge me going through. So at the professional level, the leaders that I admire are the people who ask good questions and have learnt not to judge.
Yeah. And you talked about Obama before. One thing that always stood out to me with him, regardless of political affiliation or anything else, but what I imagine, just the incredible weight of that job. You never saw that in the way he spoke or his interactions. It seemed like he was almost carefree, that he loved his job and was just, I'm still have no idea how he managed to do that day in, day out for,
And it's the little actions that you notice as well. I mean, okay, Pope Francis has passed away this week. I love the fact that he's been recognised for washing the feet of prisoners, that he's been remembered for the very human touches that he insisted on doing going through. And I think, I mean, for me, okay, if I added another person there, I don't come from a Catholic background myself, but I can have incredible respect for what he's done. Not from so much from what he's achieved. He has achieved a lot, but more from the person he was so authentic. And he obviously quite clearly knew that the risk of a position like he had was to be seen as the king, whatever else, and have everyone sort of do everything for him. But no, the choices he made about where he lived, how he lived his day, and the actions were very deliberate and so important. I think that's what I loved about being able to go into any space in the school, Northern Beaches, or into the spaces at Learnlife and the 3 different hubs that we have there, is to notice the single child and to smile with them. You don't actually always have to talk and say, what are you doing, or anything else. But to get the recognition that we're all fellow humans, and this should be fun. Yeah.
And finally, best advice you've ever received?
Yeah. Okay. I'll go back to the board chair, a guy called Peter King. I just recently went with him to Rwanda. He's in his late 80s, almost 90. The advice he gave me when he asked me at Northern Beaches to create the best school in Australia. And then, not that I ignored that, because I guess my focus became global. But he said to me, if you're ever going to travel, always travel with someone else and a team. And I think that was incredibly liberating advice, because it meant that I could budget in not just 1 or 2 others traveling with me, but at times, if we could afford it or work out how to do it, to have the whole group of people where we could actually process something together. And then I can think of coffee shops around the world or different places where we would create the new protocol for what we're going to do. This is the vision we've suddenly caught, but that was because we got permission to do it collaboratively. And I think that's why. So the best advice I have had and would give is learn to collaborate deeply, because you'll never co-create until you've collaborated.
Fantastic. Well, look, thanks so much for joining me today, Stephen. It's been really great chatting with you, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
It's been fun, and it's been a great series of questions to think through. Yes, it's always good to reflect on yourself as a leader. So thank you very much.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks, mate. Thanks so much for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, etc. Drop a comment below to let me know anything you'd like covered in upcoming episodes or suggestions for future guests. You can also connect with me on Instagram and LinkedIn.